host today. Neil Dunbar, James Cook University, Townsville, North Queensland. Let's get on with it. UEFA, acronym, Union of European Football Associations. Basically, the administrative body for football in Europe and parts of Asia. 54 national members, main headquarters Nyon in Switzerland. The current president, Michel Platini, the ex-famous French international footballer. Okay. Introduction. And I agree with Mark, the world game, football and its labour market. Football has basically implemented labour market controls to regulate both payments and movements of players. We've had maximum wage, retain and transfer, and of course, since the famous case of Bosman, 1995, contract between the club and the player. Generally been accepted as being okay because there is that interdependence between the clubs. The clubs need each other. They need each other. And if one club fails, goes down, fixtures are lost. The competition loses credibility. The clubs need each other. And the clubs need certainty with regard to players when they're building their sides. On the other side of things, we have to look at it from the player's point of view. Short careers, looking to make the most they can out of that short career. When we're looking at the UEFA regulations, what is really interesting is that these impose conditions on the clubs and that indirectly can affect the players. What are we going to do in this presentation? Well, we're going to look at the background to the regulations, why the regulations came into place, what the regulations are, and then we'll have a very brief, it's got to be in this time limit that we have, a brief assessment of the regulations, looking particularly at the main elements, overdue payables, and the break-even requirement. Okay, background first. I said I'd go there, so here we go. Why did they come into force? Well, they came into force because there was a concern over the financial position of European football clubs. How did this arise? Let's go back to the early 1990s. Big money comes in to football through television rights, TV rights, development of technology, see games all over the world. Huge amounts of money coming into the game. What does that mean? Bees round a honeypot. Wealthy entrepreneurs want a part of the action. They want to be there. The only problem is, of course, not every team can win. In fact, you can only have one winner in every competition. So you find clubs in debt. In 2009, of the 655 European soccer clubs, more than 50% were running at a loss for the previous year. We have examples. Sorry, I'm running behind here. We have examples. Portsmouth, Premier League side, won the FA Cup in 2008, 2010 in administration, out of administration, back in administration in 2012. Now, unfortunately, in the fourth tier of English football, being owned and run much more conservatively now by the Pompey Supporters Club. And even worse, Glasgow Rangers, one of the premier sides in Scotland. Into liquidation in 2012, had to start all over again back in the fourth tier of the Scottish League, now back up into the second tier, but still struggling financially. So, the regulations. Agreed in principle in September 2009, and agreed in principle by the clubs. Approved in May 2010 by the clubs. Updated in 2012. When we're looking at the regulations, there are two main areas that we need to consider. General objectives. Basically, the aim, from a general perspective, is to promote and improve football in Europe. How are they going to do this? Well, the objectives say looking after, caring for young players, making sure that clubs have adequate management and organisation, that they have well-equipped facilities. They're looking to protect the smooth running of the UEFA competitions, looking to allow the development of benchmarking for clubs, and that wonderful phrase, looking for best practice. And we need to tie these general objectives in with Article 16, which deals with the licensing criteria that have to be met by each club before they get their licence. I'm not going to go through them all, there's hundreds of them. Well, not quite as many as hundreds, but quite a number. Article 17, they have to have a youth development programme. 18, youth teams. 23, a policy to tackle racism. 24, an approved stadium. 25, approved training facilities. So you can see what they're doing. They're trying to get the clubs generally into a good order. And then we turn to the other side of the coin, the financial side. And here, the main objective is to achieve, would you believe, financial fair play. How are they going to do that? Well, they're looking to improve the financial capabilities of clubs. They're looking to protect clubs' creditors. They're wanting to also protect the viability of European club football. They want to bring more discipline to club finances. They want clubs to actually operate within their own revenue. And they want clubs to show responsible spending. Okay, it's a conservative approach to finance, getting the clubs on a firm, solid footing. To help attain these financial objectives, there are two main areas that need to be looked at. Overdue payables, can I put it simply? Money owed to creditors. And secondly, break-even requirement, the break-even requirement. I'd like to have a look at these, if you wouldn't mind, just a little bit more detail. They're absolutely crucial to the regulations. Firstly, overdue payables, money owed. Actually, under the regulations, they're split into two areas. Article 49 deals with money due to other football clubs, and Article 50, money due to employees and social, and of course our old favourite, the tax authorities. Yes? Now, there is an ethical side to this. The idea ethically is it isn't fair for a club to use players that they haven't fully paid for or they aren't actually paying. That's the ethical thing behind the overdue payables. And what the regulations do, they provide a more regular checking point to make certain that debts are not outstanding for too long. Articles 65 and 66 provide for checks in March and June, if necessary, each year. And of course, what else do the regulations do? They provide UEFA with the ability to take action against clubs if they do have debts outstanding. The other provision is the break-even requirement. Simply put, what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about each club balancing their books, or, if you prefer, to cover their own expenses from revenue. There is an ethical argument here. The ethical argument is that income needs to be attributable to each club's sporting success, tradition, and reputation. From the exploits on the field, from the history of the club, what they've done in the past. Not money from a wealthy club owner or benefactor. And the ethical part comes into the situation when you look at the definition of revenue, so far as the regulations are concerned. Revenue means that it has to come from gate receipts, broadcasting rights, sponsorship and advertising, merchandise. Now, monitoring periods is the next little thing I want to talk about. The UEFA realise, as we all do, that sport's a mercurial game. Up 1 minute, down the next. Win 1 year, not so successful the next. So when they're looking to impose this break-even provision, it's over a 3-year period, not just 1 year, not every year, over a 3-year period. So you could fall foul, have losses 1 year, but if you do well in the other 2 years, then you're not going to be in breach of the break-even provision. Okay. They also provide an allowance of 5 million euros for each monitoring period, taking the view that in the scheme of things, in the scheme of football, 5 million euros is not a huge amount of money. They also provide transitional allowances up to 40 million. Okay, in fact, it's 40 million for 2014-15 this year, and then it's going to be 30 million for the next 3 seasons, and it'll gradually work its way down to 0. And to qualify for this transitional allowance, it has to be covered by contribution payments from the club owner or related parties. So, let's have a little bit of an assessment of the overdue payables. I'm going to do this by way of an example and then mention a few statistics for you. The example I'm going to provide is the example of Malaga, because they suffered the worst in the first round of overdue payables. They were fined 300 million euros and were actually banned from taking part in the UEFA competition in 2013-14. Okay? They'd had serious infringements with regard to paying of players and also paying transfer fees. Now, Malaga weren't very happy about the situation, so what do? They trot off to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, place their case there. Unfortunately, they weren't successful. So they had to undergo their ban. UEFA, of course, are very keen to promote the success of the overdue payables, and they tell us that in 2011 the overdue payable amount was 57 million euros, and it's come down in 3 years to 8 million euros, basically an 86% reduction. Break-even requirement. Let's have a quick look at this. The obvious example to take here is Manchester City. In fact, Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain were dealt with very, very similarly. And both were fined heavily, 60 million euros. But note, 2/3 of the fine was suspended if they were able to show better results in 2014 and 2015. Okay. They also had a number of their players reduced from the UEFA squads from 25 to 21, so they had less players to choose from. There were 1 or 2 other punishments as well, but we haven't really got time to go into huge amounts of detail there. They weren't happy about the situation in Manchester City. They thought that they had basically met the requirements, but there were issues over secondary sponsorship being related, and it also related to some of their satellite teams that they have, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, if I have time. Okay. Now, UEFA, in the end, though, they decided to accept the fine on the basis that they thought it was best for football, for their club and supporters, and they also feel very certain that they're going to be able to meet the break-even provisions in the future. And when you've got someone like Sheikh Mansour in charge, owning the club, he's already put £500 million into Manchester City. I'm afraid that €18 million that he was asked to pay was not really going to cause him too much of a problem. Okay, so UEFA, they see the break-even requirements, as perhaps you would expect, as being successful. They point out that in the 12-13 season, there had been a €600 million deduction in aggregate losses. That was a 36% decrease on previous figures. They also showed that revenue growth, 6.9%, had outpaced wage growth, 6.54%, and that was the first time that had actually occurred since they kept records in 2006. So, conclusion. Well, it's been generally well received by the clubs. Well, let's go back to what we said first. They approved the regulations in the first place, so it's perhaps not totally surprising that they're reasonably happy with the situation. Also note the transparent approach by UEFA, very open about everything that they've done. Okay? The other thing that needs to be noted is that the gradual implementation of the regulations, approved in principle 2009, only started to come into effect 2011, 2012. And you've got transitional provisions there, so it's been thought out fairly carefully. The other thing is that UEFA, throughout this process, have sought the approval from the European Commission. And indeed, last October, on the 14th of October actually last year, there was an arrangement for cooperation between UEFA and the European Commission, basically. And the European Commission actually came out in favour of the regulations and actually said in that agreement that they favoured them. We're going to return to this in a moment. Well, that basically is what I wanted to say, and I suppose the last point is that it's too early to call, but basically it's looking pretty encouraging. But I still think I've got a few minutes left. Thank you. I thought I had. Good, because I want to raise one or two points of interest now, go into a little bit more detail in certain areas, if I can. This is where it gets quite exciting, actually. Legal proceedings. Daniel Striani, remember that name? Daniel Striani. UEFA certainly will, I'm sure. Last year, he lodged a complaint to the European Commission. Basically, he's arguing that the regulations are anti-competitive, that the regulations negatively impact on his ability to generate an income. And you should say, and I should have said already, Daniel Striani is a football agent. He's used to wheeling and dealing with the transfer of football players, for which he gets paid a commission. Okay, so he's taken this action to the European Commission. Last October, the Commission said that they weren't taking any further action. Now, you might think that was the end of the situation, but of course it's not. That is not a formal determination. They chose that route because Daniel has decided to take legal action within the Belgium court. And European Commission realised that, and that's where they thought the matter was probably best dealt with. Okay? And indeed, that's where it is. And you know that today it's the second day of the hearing over there in Brussels. The second day of the hearing. It's a 2-day hearing, so it'll be very interesting to see how things materialise with the Daniel Striani case. The other case, and I don't know much about this, is only really just kicked off, but in the French court, Paris Saint-Germain supporters have also begun legal action, as I understand it. So we've got some stuff taking place. Right. Likelihood of success Mr. Striani. Well, it won't be so easy for John Louis Dupont as it was for him in Bosman. Who's John Louis Dupont? He's the same lawyer who acted in the Bosman case almost 20 years ago, and he's now acting for Striani. In the Bosman case, the situation was much more straightforward. Bosman's rights to work were being severely restricted, and it wasn't really surprising that the European Court found in his favour. The situation here is different, I think. Even if the court rules that the regulations have an anti-competitive object or effect, it could still be legal. This is because breaches of competition law can be considered justified and therefore gain an exemption if they are aimed at achieving legitimate objectives and provided they are necessary and proportionate to the achievement of those objectives. So really, it's all to play for. Will be very, very interesting to see what happens. Likelihood of further cases? Well, I think it'll very much depend on the Striani case, and I think it will take a fair time for it to be decided, because I very much suspect that probably the case will go from Brussels to the European Court, down the track. Looking at it generally, you would think that the clubs would be the most likely people to contest the regulations, but as we noted, they of course have already agreed to it. So perhaps that explains why they're reasonably happy with the situation. And note, some of the clubs are being quite clever in the way that they deal with the situation, I feel. I mean, clubs like Chelsea, Abramovich, lots and lots of money gone in there. Lots and lots of common sense too. Manchester City, once again, lots and lots of money, but also some good thinking behind it. In the case of Chelsea, being very shrewd in the transfer market, buying players like Juan Mata for 25 million and then selling him for 50 million to Manchester United. Also very clever with the use of the loan system, loaning players out to other clubs who then pay, of course, their wages. They come back and either they play, as the goalkeeper does, Courtois, in the first team, or has done until recently, or they sell them on. Lukaku, out on loan, originally purchased for 10 million, sold for 28 million. Manchester City, another club, using their bottle. Okay? Plenty of money, of course, to help them along the way, but they've got interests in other countries. New York City to be exact, the club there in the Major League Soccer. We know that they've got interests here, don't we? Melbourne City, here in Australia. And also they've got another feeder club, Yokohama F. Marinos in Japan. Very useful to be able to use those players. You've got Frank Lampard, who's contracted to the New York side. I'm being told it's time. I knew I would run out of time. Can I just say a couple of things? So basically, they're using that loan system very much to their effect. Just two other points I want to make, and then I really will close up, because criticisms of the regulations. One criticism, and I think it's got some merit, it tends to preserve the status quo. Because basically the clubs with the bigger revenues will be able to spend more, and that will keep themselves in their higher positions. Okay? It does prevent risk, but I think that that's really what UEFA were trying to manage. Positives, it brings securities to clubs and players and provides a solid platform for European soccer. And the last point, I'm sorry to go over time, I have to buy you a drink later. Just have a look at the situation over here. Would these regulations be of any use here in Australia? Well, we do have some problems in the football world, don't we? Nathan Tinkler Newcastle Jets, he's found struggled a bit to pay his bills lately. Yes? We've also had rumours of Perth having problems with their salary cap. And here on the Gold Coast, going to a different sport, of course, we've had the poor misfortune afflicting the Gold Coast. The important thing, I think, is you need to compare apples with apples. It's a different situation here as to what it is in Europe. It's a much smaller situation over here than it is in Europe. For instance, there's no promotion or relegation in our Hyundai A-League. So we need to keep the teams competitive. We need to keep them on an even power. We don't want one club winning the competition every year. It's going to become extremely boring. Okay? In the Premier League, for instance, you've got fighting for European places, relegation to consider. It doesn't matter quite so much over there. But here we have the use, don't we, of the salary cap. 2.55 million Australian dollars for each of the clubs. There are some exclusions for marquee players as well. But I think that over here in Australia, my feeling is that the salary cap works really well, and I think it's probably the best way to go. What I now ask you, do you think the regulations over in Europe are good or bad? Thank you very much.